So this always happens, Pritesh. That's why I said I'll edit all this stuff out.
I was going to say, you don't see it at the front, do you? It's all behind the scenes.
Oh, no, it's very slick when it goes to air. Hello and welcome to Pulse Amplify, where we sit down with the leaders and change makers shaping the future of health. Proudly brought to you by Pulse IT News. I'm your host, Louise Schaefer.
And I'm your other host, George Margellis.
Today on Pulse, we're joined by Pritesh Mistry, Fellow for Digital Technologies at the King's Fund, one of the UK's most influential health policy think tanks. Now, Pritesh sits at the intersection of technology, policy, and the messy, practical reality of getting digital health to actually work inside a system as vast and pressured as the NHS. His work really cuts through hype. You can read all about it on LinkedIn. He's a regular contributor there. And he asks harder questions, like not just what can AI do, but what infrastructure, workforce and culture change has to be in place before it does any good, and who gets left behind if we rush it and don't do it well. Pritesh has recently published a King's Fund analysis titled, Is the NHS Ready for the AI-Powered Patient? It was drawn from a roundtable with NHS leaders, technology developers, patient reps, clinicians and policymakers. And its central provocation is one close to the heart of what George and I love to talk about on this show, which is a consumer health revolution is already reshaping people's relationship with their own health. And the NHS essentially has three choices: ignore it, react to it, or actively shape it. I think this is a brilliant companion to conversations we've had recently on the pod about patients using AI. So we're delighted to dig into this topic, Pritesh. Thank you so much for joining us on the show and welcome to the Pulse Pod studio.
Hello, it's great to be here and thank you for the invitation to join you.
It's great to have you here, Pritesh.
We will dig into the article straight away. It starts with a provocative idea that the NHS is no longer the centre of a person's healthcare experience, and you identify three major forces behind it: consumer technology, generational change, and employers even becoming more involved in health. So how controversial are these ideas in the UK? Like, were you nervous writing it? And is the NHS still thinking of itself as the health system when really it's become one participant of a much larger ecosystem?
So I think, yes, it is a provocative idea. The NHS is a highly cherished institution for many people and for very good reasons. However, I think it's also clear that the NHS, like many healthcare systems, is under pressure, and for many of the same reasons, like demographic changes, inequalities, geopolitical issues. We don't have enough workforce. There's the disruption of innovations as well. I don't think it is widely accepted. It was a little bit nerve-wracking to put that down on the screen, I suppose, less paper these days. But I think it is an acknowledged truth. But I think there's also partly some nuance as well. So it's true for some, it's not true for others. And so for some, that shift has already happened and they're living it today. But for others, it will likely occur in the near future. And for others, again, it may not happen at all. But it's difficult to say it's a provocative idea for a whole public when there's a whole spectrum of experiences that are happening at any one time.
But the NHS is seen as the quintessential centralised, socialised medicine delivery service. And as you point out, the Brits love it. The fact that you actually had a whole segment at your Olympic Games opening of the NHS, the Australian Olympic Games, it said nothing about us poor medicos here. So
we had the man from Snowy River though, George.
That's true. It would have been good to have a place at the Olympic opening. So it's perceived as a quintessentially centralised, government-managed, top-down system. And yet you're suggesting here that in actual fact, the world is changing radically. And you've used some really great examples of how it's actually happening. So for example, the use of weight loss drugs. 9 out of 10 people using GLP-1s in the UK are going through that privately. As the world of the NHS GP who looked after you from birth to death starting to disappear?
As you rightly say, the NHS is a huge system. It covers the entirety of England and the four nations. But in being so large, it takes time. It takes time to react and respond. And what we see is the world is moving a lot quicker than it used to. And so that statistic in particular is based on work that was published in August 2025. What we're hearing from anecdotal conversations with the public is generally the NHS services are not able to meet that patient demand for obesity medication at that pace. And so patients are choosing to go through private self-paid routes, largely digitally mediated, because of the pace, the speed, the responsiveness that they want to be able to access those services. And the NHS takes time to allocate funding, to put the right mechanisms to place, to identify which patients are going to be eligible. And so patients are taking it upon themselves, the public are taking it upon themselves to be proactively accessing these medications. And what's really interesting is it's independent of deprivation indices. So it's not necessarily the people who are affluent only who are reaching for this mechanism and the others are waiting for the NHS. It's across deprivation indices. So I think that shows significant patient motivation, agency, and digital engagement as well. So there's a lot of concerns around digital exclusion. But again, what we're seeing is when there's motivation and willingness, then people are able to overcome a lot of those digital barriers and access medications at speed. So what it means is that the NHS isn't moving fast enough for the public's demand for healthcare. It means that people's expectations are changing based on private suppliers, both good and bad. So there's opportunities for the NHS here, as well as particular considerations and threats.
But the perception is that the NHS handled everything. So the fact that now people are starting to move away from that is an interesting paradigm.
It is. I think it is showing a change in people's behaviour, people's expectations, what they look for the NHS for. And absolutely, this is really personal, isn't it? It's about how culture perceives what people should look like and what shape people should have and what people want to indicate to the wider world of how they look and all these other things. And so it's entangled within healthcare well-being, but also how you feel about yourself as an individual. And it's very complex.
I guess shows like Geordie Shore's and Love Island probably influence that to some degree as well.
Yes, we all live in a social media world as well, don't we?
I can't believe this is the first time Geordie Shore has come up on this show. You strike some really interesting stats in this. And there's a comparison in the roundtable where you've written consumer health AI tools answer 10 million health queries a day. And what does the NHS do in comparison? Well, they deliver 1 million interactions every 36 hours. And when you sit with that scale, what's the honest implication for how the NHS has to see its own role and how it is already changing?
I would say the scale and the quality are both important. The scale of AI means that you can do harm at such a greater pace as well. So we shouldn't forget about the need for the quality and the trustworthiness of these tools. But these figures are absolutely incredible. And I suppose just step back a bit, and if we look at the NHS website, so 8 million visits a day in 2022, with AI overviews kind of consuming all of that information now. NHS app has 7 million repeat prescriptions a month. These are different types of contact.
Yep.
But I think what we need to really acknowledge is the NHS website and the internet are several decades old. Apps are 2 decades old. This level of interaction with generative AI tools is maybe a few years old. And the speed at which we're seeing this happen and the appetite of the public in using these tools is just jaw-dropping,
and
quite
it's global.
frankly. I think global, absolutely global. And so what's stark to us, it's not necessarily the scale, but the speed at which that scale has happened. And it's the traction amongst the public. And let's be honest, that information has been out there for a long time. You know, people have been Googling information for a long time. We're all familiar with that phrase, Dr. Google. But what we're seeing now is that the way people are accessing information has changed. That mechanism of searching on the internet and finding websites and trawling websites and all the other things doesn't suit people anymore. People are drawing on these Gen AI tools for health-seeking information, and we're seeing it being correlated with out of hours. So it's meeting people's needs. It's meeting people where they are. People aren't having to go to several different places to try and pick information. They're going to one place to translate medical jargon, explain symptoms, explain medication, understand treatment options. So I think the question, again, for me is, can the NHS operate at this scale, at this speed, with this technology? Does it work in partnership? What's that kind of combination that it needs to work within that greater sphere of different technologies and innovations that are now coming online all at the same time?
And the reality is they're competing with some very aggressive players in the market. Since November 22, when ChatGPT was first launched, we've seen Anthropic, we've seen Perplexity, we've seen Grok, we've seen all these players coming to market, and they're coming in a big way. We've seen some of the valuations. Today, we saw the SpaceX IPO in the US, and there's just the sheer scale of what we're competing as. Can a public goods service like the NHS compete with a commercial entity that's looking to turn its owner into a trillionaire? So it's a really interesting challenge, isn't it?
I think you can compete, George. It's just a matter of what scale are we judging competition on.
It's hard to compete with a single trillionaire, but hey, you never know. But so alongside this direct-to-consumer innovation, you're also pointing out the generational change. So we all know that my children are born with a mobile phone in their hand and they haven't seen an encyclopedia in their life and they have no idea what a library is, but they have access to more information than I ever had available. And I often use the example, when I went through med school, I spent 5 hours a day in the med school library because that's where we got everything. When my son graduated from med school, he had journals at his fingertip. He could pick up New England Journal of Medicine at 2 o'clock in the morning on his phone. I had to wait till 8 o'clock in the morning for the library to open. Can you unpack what this generational change is?
Yeah, so much to unpack there. And I love that explanation of how information access has changed and that information asymmetry has changed. So as we're seeing life expectancies increase, the knock-on implication is you've got a greater range of generations with different expectations and different experience of accessing public services and consumer services. And so that expectation then trends into healthcare services. So it becomes broader in what they expect and what they understand around their health services and their health needs. And that then starts going into exactly what you're saying. These people generally are more familiar with technologies. It's just part of the world. It's part of their ecosystem. It's part of how they live their lives. They live and breathe digital and data. And so there's different expectations of what a healthcare service does, from physical health through to prevention, through to wellness, well-being, nutrition, ... And so that's just what a healthcare system should be doing for different generations from a generational perspective. But as you mentioned with the digital aspects, what we're seeing is there's different digital and data literacy capabilities that are coming into those generations as well. As we start going into the Gen Z and the Gen Alpha, they're listening to social media influencers who are talking about nutrition, healthy sleep behaviors. It's starting to bleed into some of the sports medicine kind of stuff where you start thinking about your cool down days and your stretching and your nutrition and your well-being and your sleep and your wearables data and your blood tests and how does this feed into that. And so what we're starting to see is a really significant change with those different generations and how digital and data are being fed into what they expect within healthcare services. And that's irrespective of geographies, quite honestly. We're seeing that across generations in different geographies. Now, coming back to the UK and the NHS specifically, what we're seeing is people at age 16 to 35 are reporting poor experiences with the NHS. Gen Z are more likely to use private healthcare. 42% of 18 to 24-year-olds reported that they're more likely to use private healthcare. So we're starting to see, I suppose, attitudinal shifts specifically in the UK with our younger generations when it comes to the NHS as well. Hence why we're starting to talk about those generational attitudes.
And what about NHS exceptionalism? Because you use that phrase, which I haven't heard used before. We always talk about US exceptionalism that is rampant in the US. So tell us about this NHS exceptionalism. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think this is something that came out several times during that roundtable that we based our analysis on. And it's come out in the conversation today as well. So the NHS is seen as being exceptional on a global scale. It was part of, as you mentioned, our opening ceremony for the Olympics. And it's a matter of pride for the country, and people recognise that the NHS is there for them in times of dire need, when there's health emergencies and it saves people's lives and all these other things. But what came out particularly in the roundtable is the NHS believes and treats itself as the highest quality marker for health services. And any healthcare engagement that happens outside of the NHS needs to be validated by the NHS before it can be accepted. And that means that the healthcare system potentially duplicates activity, duplicates tests that it may not need to do. And when we're in a time of resource constraints, when health services are under pressure, is that a responsible thing for a healthcare system to do? Is that exceptionalism a valid thing in the future and where we are today?
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I mean, the NHS exceptionalism from a consumer perspective, I can understand that. But here in Australia, we see a lot of NHS refugees, so a lot of doctors and clinicians and nurses from the NHS who travel halfway across the world to come live and work in Australia because from their perspective, the NHS doesn't necessarily treat them exceptionally. Is that just purely a sign of the stress it's under? They're under-resourced with huge expectations tied to it?
That's a great question. As we see workforce shifting and changing. We see people coming to work in the NHS as much as people leaving to work elsewhere. So I think partly the NHS is a highly pressurised environment. I think many healthcare services are. The pressures may be slightly different in the NHS compared to in Australia, and that might suit some people and not suit others. But I suppose what we're seeing is high demand, and that's not necessarily unique to the NHS. Significant resource constraints, again, not unique to the NHS, but increasingly we're seeing that demand supply gap widen. And this is why we see the rise of a multi-service system.
The consensus we see here from our NHS refugees is that when they get the weekend off here, there's actually sunshine outside, so they get to sit in the sun for a while.
George, we shouldn't be recruiting when we've got someone from the UK here. Now, your third force in your piece was the greater role for employers, and that strikes fear, I think, in everyone's mind, the idea of a US-style system with employers responsible. You talked about the Keep Britain Working Review and this idea of a multi-provider work marketplace of services. So that would indicate a very meaningful shift in who's responsible for health at work. So tell us more about this and the opportunities and risks that you see in this initiative of employers being more involved.
It's a significant shift, both in terms of how services are provided, but people's expectations as well. So the Keep Britain Working Review is a government review that's been published recently, and the intention is to try and understand how to keep people healthy and in the workplace and actively at work for longer. And so it's basically lays out a shift from the health of an individual being the responsibility of that individual and the health service to being a responsibility between the individual, the employer, and the health service. And that's quite a significant shift. It's going to mean changes in attitude, changes in responsibilities of employers as well. But realistically, what it means is employers are going to have to provide employees with health support, particularly around occupational health, musculoskeletal support as well. And these could potentially be through NHS services. However, as we've already touched on, the NHS is severely under pressure. So it's likely it will be other service providers, private providers, the ones that have been going direct to consumers already, who will be tapped to provide this kind of support for employees. And so that is necessarily going to have to sit alongside NHS services. It's going to have to tap into NHS records. It's going to have to provide support around NHS services where people have drawn on NHS services, or be able to feed into NHS services when people dip back into the NHS. So it forces that constellation of services to start widening beyond the NHS. And so it is a significant shift. It's going to change people's perception of where they get health services from, people's experience beyond the NHS.
It's interesting because obviously the US has a very strong employer-focused health insurance model, and the NHS is the exact opposite. It's a government-controlled model. When you start seeing this sort of mixing of the services, does that provide challenges to continuity of care, to data being locked away in silos?
Yeah, so that kind of privacy of the individual will need to be respected. And hopefully there will be a view that is a holistic care approach for individuals. The data challenge is, as you rightly say, going to be particularly pertinent, especially we've got a fragmented data ecosystem within the NHS. And so adding more data sources potentially adds more complexity. However, we're familiar and aware that the fragmentation exists. So with that knowledge means that we should be able to do something about it. Whether we can or not is a different question. So I think that there is reasons to be concerned, but we know what good looks like. And so we should keep that in mind.
Yeah. Well, time for a quick break. And when we return, we're going to be discussing whether health professionals and the system are ready to share authority with better informed patients. And finally, Pritish's advice to the new health secretary, whomever that may be. You've got 3 steps needed to move the NHS to a multi-service system that serves consumers, which is a pragmatism to meet people where they are, the ability to critically appraise health information that patients bring in, and understanding how consumer AI will complement, replace, or add to NHS activity. From your experience, do you think the health professions and the system is ready to share authority with better informed patients?
That's a great question, isn't it?
Is that a simple yes or no?
It's never a simple yes or no. That's my whole job. So healthcare services like the NHS have been on a journey of sharing authority with the patient for a number of years. So we've had things like person-centered care and shared decision-making, and that particularly is very important, palliative care instances and end-of-life care. So as George mentioned, the health information asymmetry has radically changed over the last few decades. Historically, healthcare systems have been paternalistic, and that's largely through that asymmetry of knowledge and information. But now education and information is available in so many different formats, and that's changed that significantly. And it's not uncommon for clinicians to experience patients coming into that consultation with their smartphone and a Google website or some links. They bring in wearable information, app data, and it's become more and more common, especially now we've seen blood glucose monitoring, for example, in type 1 diabetes, and people have that data in their hand. So I think it's happened slowly. And that's a good thing, right? And I'm very much of the opinion that a better informed, better engaged person is more likely to be able to self-care, make informed decisions, and manage their own health and well-being. There is an increased expectation from healthcare services now as well. What we're seeing is a shift towards, well, you need to be responsible for your own healthcare as well. So yes, that asymmetry has changed in terms of medical knowledge and information, but the responsibility is also shifted as well. Healthcare systems are now having to say, we can't do everything. And there's also responsibility on the individual. So I think that has evolved over time. Professionals, some, I'd say, are ready, not everyone. I think what we specifically try and lay out in this analysis is what's different this time is the information is coming from very many different sources. That information might not be validated. And so there's a need to carry on care based on very different information sources coming through. Some might have hallucinations, some might be reliable. How do you understand that? Then you've got this AI that's emerging. It's sycophantic by nature, potentially again has incorrect information, but patients are using them. And then there's also this risk sharing aspect that I think is very different. So if we're thinking about healthcare services and guidance from many different sources, how do you share that risk, that liability, when what we've been used to in the NHS is responsible for everything? But now the NHS has to share that with maybe a direct consumer provider or private provider. How do you ascertain whether a patient has the right level of confidence and critical appraisal of an AI tool? And so how do you do that risk sharing in a way that you're having a conversation with a patient and they are having an informed decision and you're able to ascertain that they're able to make that informed decision?
I think that's a very valid point. And to quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. But in this context, that power is now shifting to the consumer. But in a medico-legal aspect, all responsibility tends to lie back with the healthcare system. And you're honest in your report that you've reached no consensus on whether consumer AI will widen or narrow inequalities. I mean, we know that AI is a great tool, and whilst initially it was fairly freely available, we're now starting to see cost constraints and access constraints and all those sort of issues around it. Where do you see it going? How do you think we should be thinking about the equitable use of these technologies Is it something that the government should provide as a public service? Is it free market forces come into play? Or is it something that we're going to have to watch and wait and see how it evolves?
Yeah, equity is super important. And I don't think we can ever be sure on what's going to happen in the future. The way governments work and public services work is you make a 5-year or a 10-year plan, and that's the kind of direction of travel. But what we're seeing is a massively, rapidly changing external environment. And we need to shift to more of a kind of plan, learn and adjust. And as you mentioned, we do not reach a consensus on whether consumer AI tools will widen or narrow inequalities. What we've seen through our research is a lot of assumptions, but actually when you give people the tools and the support, that they will use digital tools in ways that surprise you. And so people from very different backgrounds, people who are homeless through to people who are affluent, are very able to use digital tools. People who are younger generation through to people who are older are also equally able when they have the support around them. And so I think there's something absolutely important around using the data and having access to the data of who's using the AI tools by different demographics and different regions, not identifiable information, but to be able to understand, broadly speaking, who's benefiting, who's struggling. We've already got fantastic initiatives in the UK that build on our local councils, our local charities, our local communities, that then wrap around individuals to support them to overcome digital exclusion. I think there's a real opportunity here to build on those, to not hardwire plans, but instead create a public who have AI readiness as a core capability within them. And that's around peer support. It's around building knowledge, skills and confidence. And that creates a level of capability in the public that means that they are able to use these consumer AI tools in a way that works for them. And what we'd like to see, and what came out very strongly in the roundtable, is agency. And using these tools to better advocate for yourself, to be able to make better informed decisions. But to be able to do that, we need to support people to be able to use these tools.
Well, your conclusion is, spoiler alert for those who haven't read it yet, is that the third path, which is the NHS as a leading voice at the table rather than just doing everything itself, makes the most sense. So if you had the ear of the Secretary of State, and I believe you do, for 10 minutes, what's the one thing you'd urge them to start now? And also, what should the NHS stop doing immediately?
What a great question. And I wish I had the ear of the Secretary of State for 10 minutes. Although it's one of those things that when you get asked a question around one thing, suddenly you find yourself on your soapbox and it's like, and another thing, and another thing, and another thing. Exactly. But let me try and prioritise. So I think the NHS in the UK has amazing strengths. And so I would say that to start doing is to be at that table, to convene at that table and look at those generations that we've already talked about and say, look, these people are living a multi-service system right now. So how do we start creating that service in a way that works for these individuals? And so I think that there needs to be a body of work doing that. And what I would say that the NHS needs to stop doing is going back to that NHS exceptionalism. So understanding and being comfortable with the NHS not needing to do everything, but being there for people in ways that the people expect.
Perfect. All right. Well done. You didn't have a hugely long list.
Well, I'm holding myself back.
Yeah.
You do have the challenge of working out who the Secretary of State for Health is at any particular day of the week.
That is true. By the time this goes to air, it might be somebody different.
Yes, we have got changes happening, but our Secretary of State just spoke at a conference and said that the plans remain in place. So the NHS 10-year plan, the medium-term planning framework, the work that's already happening will stay in place. A huge focus remains on AI as well. And I suppose if I was to add one more thing in to stop doing it, stop thinking of AI as the solution to everything.
Oh, it's not going to solve it's not.
It does seem to be like, oh yeah, we have these problems, we'll do this and we'll rely on AI. And it's just this kind of, you drop it over there as a kind of, fine, AI will deal with this. And we need to think about that a little bit more, don't we?
Yeah, a little bit more.
I do have to say that the one thing I've always admired about the NHS, like it's been around for 75 years, it remains as an entity. And whilst healthcare does get politicised, it doesn't seem to get as politicised in the UK as it does in other parts of the world. So I think that there is a stability around NHS exceptionalism, which is an advantage as well. So it's not all bad news.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well put. Thank you, George.
Pritesh, thank you so much for joining us in the studio today. You've been a wonderful guest, and we would definitely have to get you back on because there's so much happening in the UK. George and I often discuss it in our hot topic shows. So it'd be great to get you back on and we can do some further deep dives into that wonderful country of yours and how we're going to fix healthcare collectively.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Pulse, brought to you by Pulse IT News. Pulse is produced by me, Louise Schaefer, and by Ivan Jurek of Octopod Productions. Thanks to Emily Mara for all of her support. And big thanks to all of you guys for listening. We love that you do. Thank you so much. And thanks for all of you who recommend it to a friend. Now, please make sure you do subscribe, follow and rate us wherever you get your podcasts, and visit pulseit.news to catch up on all the news from Australia, New Zealand and Ireland. Send any feedback or topic suggestions to pulsepod@pulseit.news. We always love to hear from you guys. Bye.